The arguments for female pastors are honestly pretty weak. Now, the only reason I'm bringing this up right now is because just this week there was another controversy related to a female pastor. And in this case, this particular individual pictured right here gave a rather condescending and dismissive sermon in front of President Trump, which brought attention to this topic again. Now, I've done a number of videos on female pastors in the past, and as you probably know, I don't believe that female pastors are actually biblical. But for the sake of argument, what I want to do in this particular video is consider the top 5 arguments from the Bible that liberals use to try to buttress and defend the idea that female ordination is possible or plausible or even good. So I'm going to take those arguments, I'm going to consider them, and I'm going to show you why all 5 of these arguments really fail when you subject them to even the most superficial criticism as it relates to biblical context and the meaning of those texts themselves. What's up, everybody? My name is Matthew. I'm one of the pastors here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're interested in that, please come check us out. Also want to mention, before we get into today's topic, I have a new partner called Biblingo, and it's a wonderful app that you can use on your phone or your desktop if you're interested in learning biblical Greek and Hebrew. So if you want to learn the biblical languages for the very first time, just starting even with the alphabet, or if you've already been trained in the languages and you want to recover what you've lost due to attrition of knowledge, then Biblingo would be awesome. I do have a link in the description of this video if you want to go check that out. All right, well, let's get into today's topic. And besides the fact that there are female pastors in many different denominations, we should ask the question of whether or not it's a biblical thing to do. And my answer to that is no. And yet, nevertheless, certain advocates for female ordination, they proffer arguments ostensibly based on the scriptures to defend this. And we're going to look at each one of those arguments quickly here. And I should say that most of these proof texts are so thin that, again, just a superficial glance at them will immediately refute the argument. But let's take them for what they are and work through them anyway. So the first one is an argument from Deborah in Judges chapter 4, verse 4. Deborah is a prophetess, and therefore, as the argument goes, then there should likewise be female ordained ministers today. Well, a simple look at the context will really disabuse us of this particular one. We notice here in verse 1, that the text says, and this frames up the context of the story, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. Now, as you probably know, the book of Judges is framed around the context of Israel's rebellion against God. God often sends a deliverer, the people repent and are revived, and so also that cycle continues to repeat. Well, this is a cycle of decline here. It says that the people of Israel did evil, and so that line itself helps us to frame up the rest of what happens in this particular story. Now, it says in chapter 4, verse 4, now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. Well, that's to be read in light of the fact that we're already told that this is a time of evil. In other words, the moral framework of society was flipped over. And moreover, when we look carefully at the details of the story, we read about the cowardice of men, which necessitates then the rise of this particular female individual, Deborah. So it says here in verse 8, Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. So Barak is evidencing real cowardice here in his failure to discharge his duties that were given to him. And she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Now, if you know anything at all about ancient history and culture, you know that for an army or an aggressor to be defeated by a female or a female army or female warriors would, of course, be a great embarrassment and humiliation. And so when we look at the story here, in light of the rest of the book of Judges, which ends with that famous line that everyone did what was right in their own eyes, we realize that the entirety of the book of Judges is a moral disaster for the most part, and much of the book of Judges carries on in sharing these stories of how the morality of the day was twisted over and flipped backwards on itself so that it's an eroded and diminished understanding of morality and not something exemplary that we should try to imitate by way of prescription. So when we look at this, we realize, no, this text is not prescriptive for female pastors or prophetesses, but rather when we look at the story in light of its context and the irony here of the story of females rising to replace weak and cowardly men and even defeating others, what we realize here is that this is yet another illustration of the moral chaos that's intrinsic to the book of Judges. Okay, so we will dismiss that as not a good proof for female pastors. Now, secondly, what about the women at the tomb? So some who would argue for women's ordination would say, aha, but the first evangelists were actually women. The first evangelists as it relates to the resurrection of Jesus. And so they would point to Matthew chapter 28, verse 8, that the various Marys here that go to the tomb on resurrection morning were females. Obviously, nobody disputes that. And that they are commissioned to go out and to be ministers. So look at this. In 28:1, now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Okay, so nobody debates that, I wouldn't think. The Marys did go to see Jesus, and they find that he has been resurrected. And so we read this later on in the same chapter, and behold, Jesus met them and said, greetings, and they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Very well, excellent. And Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. So here Jesus tells them to go to the other disciples and apostles and to inform them of the news of the resurrection. But to suggest that this is anything like an ordination or the formation of a female ministerial office is obviously to go too far. What's happening here is not the ordination of females, but rather the commending of their witnessing to the disciples and to the apostles of the resurrection of Jesus. So here we just simply have a conflation of categories. What we have here is the confusion of the ordained offices of pastor, elder, deacon, overseer, as the case may be, with the general encouragement that we should all be witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus. So this says nothing about ordained office, and certainly everybody would suggest that females should, of course, witness to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Nobody would say that females cannot witness or share or tell what they've heard and even what they've seen and experienced in their own lives. But this is not a text that supports the prescription of females ordained into the ministerial offices. It's just not that, and to say anything otherwise is to stretch the text beyond comprehension. Next, here's another argument from those who would advocate for female ordination, the case of Phoebe from Romans chapter 16, verse 1. Now, if you're not familiar, Phoebe is the female who is sent with Paul's letter, which she wrote from Corinth about Acts chapter 20 to the Romans to bring them the gospel. Paul has not yet met the Romans in person, and so he has to dispatch a courier to bring that message, this letter, and that person is Phoebe. And in chapter 16, Paul mentions her by name. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church of Kencre, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you, for she's been a patron of many and of myself as well. So here we have a little bit of a translational dispute, because here the ESV renders it Phoebe, a servant, which I think is the correct translation here. But some of the more liberal translations, especially those with a particular axe to grind and perhaps even an agenda to advance, they translate that Phoebe, a deacon. Now, why do they do that? Well, because the Greek word for servant is the word diakonos, and diakonia is the idea of service. And so here, what they're trying to suggest is that Phoebe is something of an ordained deacon, and deacon is one of the ordained offices. But nevertheless, again, I think this is probably trying to wedge an argument into a text rather than simply translating the text for what it is. Because while the word diakonos or diakonia certainly is the root word for the ordained office of deacon, to try to translate this as though she held the office of deacon is probably just importing a worldview and an agenda into a proper translation of the text. The text most naturally reads that it's simply Phoebe is a servant of the church of Kencre. And by the way, some would argue here with the word saints that this also is some kind of a formal recognition as per like the Roman Catholic Church or the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church. But here, the word simply means one who is set apart, and all believers are called saints in the New Testament, especially in the beginnings and the ends of Paul's epistles. So that is likewise not an argument for female ordination to the deacon. And so here we would simply say that the better translations rightly do not translate this as deacon, but rather simply servants, which a most natural reading of the Greek text would imply. Next argument. Now, this is a favorite one for me because so many people made this argument in my previous denomination. I used to, before I joined the PCA, be part of the EPC. And how many times did I go to ordination examinations and somebody would defend the female offices with this text, Galatians 3:28. And I always thought, and I always objected, that it was so ironic because this text has nothing to do with ordination. Let's go ahead and read it. It says this in Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And how many times did I have to sit through an ordination trial in which somebody would defend their viewpoint of female ordination with this text and simply say that because of this, both male and females are equals before the Lord, and therefore females are free to come into the ordained offices as well. What is the main problem here? Hopefully by now you can see it. This text has nothing to do with ordination, but rather this is a text about justification by faith. This text has to do with how people are saved, not how people are ordained. And to read anything other into it is, again, an intrusion of a worldview rather than an exegesis of a text, okay? So let's not confuse ordained offices with how people are saved. Of course, both sides, I would trust, rely on the fact that we are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, but to try to stretch this text into something of a defense of female ordination is to mangle this text and to stretch it into a point of unrecognizability. Next, we should say, or I suppose we should conclude here simply by summarizing that ordination is not in view here, rather justification is what is being discussed. Now here's another interesting one, and this is a last straw. I mean, you're really straining at gnats here to try to get this one down. An argument from Junia in Romans chapter 16, verse 7, because we really don't even know much about Junia or Junius, and that's actually part of the debate right there. The text says this in Romans 16, "Greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners. They are well known to the apostles, and they were in Christ before me." We have two details here that we need to work through. First, is this phrase properly translated well known to the apostles, as the ESV has it here, and I think that's correct, or should it be they are well known among the apostles, as some translations will render this? Well, if they translate it among the apostles, they're trying to include Andronicus and Junia in that group of apostles. But as it's translated here, and I think properly so by the ESV, it's simply they are well known to the apostles. And so inasmuch as apostles can know other people that are not apostles, obviously, it's simply stating no more than that their reputation is regarded by the apostles. Okay, now the other dispute about this text is who is Junia. Now, interestingly here, we have another case of a married couple, Prisca and Aquila, who we know from other places in the New Testament, especially the book of Acts. But here we don't know a lot about Andronicus and Junia. And Paul calls them my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners. That's about all we know, at least as far as this context goes. Now, some people will read Junia as a female, and others will read this person as a male. And that's part of the controversy because the name Junius in the Greek is actually rather it's just not clear. Okay, so it's a name like Pat or Chris or something like that that could be either one. So what do? Well, you look up other uses of the name Junia in ancient literature to try to figure this out. And interestingly enough, the ancient writers are split as to whether or not Junia is a female or a male. Some of the ancient commentators think Junia was a female. Others think that this person was a male. So we look at uses of the name of Junia or Junius, and interestingly enough, the data there is split as well. A couple occasions or so, it's a female. Then there's a counterbalance in which the name is used as a male. And then there's at least some reference to Junia, and it's not clear from the context whether a male or a female is being spoken of. So again, to try to impute a whole doctrine of ordination into this text is really just to go too far. So our issues here are we don't know if Junius was male or female. Should we translate it among the apostles, which would include them in that group, or to the apostles? And I think probably the latter rendering is the better. So what do we have here? How can we conclude these arguments for female ordination? Well, I think that the data is strongly in favor of male-only ordination, and that each one of these arguments fails at critical points. To review, the priests of the Old Testament were always male. The apostles of the New Testament were the ordained men upon whom Jesus set them apart for the ministry of proclamation of the word. In the New Testament also, in the early church, we see elders and deacons being men, and we see that prescribed in 1 Timothy 2 and Titus chapter 1. Now, I do want you to know the difference between prescription and proscription. Okay, hopefully you know that, but I'll clarify this just for the sake of argument. Prescription says, do this. If you get a prescription, it means you ought to follow the instructions. And so when it comes to the ordained offices, especially in 1 Timothy 2 and Titus, the prescription is that males would take up those office places. Proscription means no. It means do not let that take place. And we do actually have several passages in the New Testament which proscribe females from taking speaking or teaching or authoritative leading roles in the church. Okay, so what can we say about all this? Well, I suppose we sum it up by saying that the arguments for female ordination are exceedingly weak, and most of the time we have a worldview in search of an exegesis rather than an exegesis leading us to particular conclusions. So I don't think that the Bible supports female officers, neither pastors nor elders nor deacons, and that leads us then to reject the legitimacy of such. All right, well, thanks for checking into this particular video. Again, I just want to remind you that if you want to learn some Greek or Hebrew, Biblingo is a great place to do that. And I have a link in the description of this video and a discount code if you want to go there and check that out. All right, thank you so much. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.